Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us again, and welcome to this fortunately final session of the Great Rethink, a collaboration between the PARI Center and the Scientific and Medical Network. For those who don't know me, I'm James P. Barbieri, Associate Program Director of the PARI Center, and I'll be your host for today. Today with me, we also have Eleanor Peat, the Program Director of the PARI Center, and David Lorimer, Director of the Scientific and Medical Network, who will assist me and you during this call. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind very quickly about the Zoom rules for this call. First of all, during the presentation, we ask participants to turn off their microphone just to ensure a better quality audio. For this reason, we may mute you if we hear any background noise. If a participant would like to ask a question or make a contribution to the discussion, if you can please use the raise your hand function on Zoom, which can be found in the reactions at the bottom of your screen. Or if you feel a bit shy, you can just write your question in the chat section and I can read it out for you. We also encourage everyone to turn on their cameras, as we believe it creates a nice educational environment, seeing everyone's faces. And finally, all sessions are recorded for archival reasons, but also for you guys, for those who couldn't attend the sessions or people who want to watch it again. The recordings will be available later this week. And now I'll just introduce our speakers. We all know Colin from previous sessions. Colin, biologist and writer, founder of the Oxford Real Farming Conference, which is a center and a movement dedicated to disseminate the ideas in agroecology and the ideas in his latest publication, The Great Rethink. And as a special guest for this session, we also welcome Ruby Reed, a curator and organizer involved in several initiatives, including the Educational Eco-Resolution, the Initiative Earth, the Be the Earth Foundation, and supported the well-known movement, the Extinction Rebellion. Today, Colin will have his presentation followed by a discussion with Ruby. After breakout rooms, which will last about 10 minutes, we'll have a short break, about 5 minutes if you have time, and then we'll move on to Q&A. In this session, Colin will focus on mindset, proposing an outlook on metaphysics, morality, science, and the arts, all needed for his great rethink. And now I'll pass it straight over to you, Colin. Welcome.
Me. Sorry, I'm a bit deaf, you know. Good. Should we have the first slide 4.1? No, slide 1.2, please, David.
1.2. So we've got 4.1 just to announce it. So I'll now go on to 1.2. I should be able to do this. With a bit of luck. And then I'll just make it full screen.
We are still seeing the poster.
Sorry?
Well, you should now be seeing the diagram.
Now we are, yes.
Yeah.
Just to say it again, I say it every time, I know, but just to be boring. This actually encapsulates in graphic form the curriculum of our college, the College for Real Farming and Food Culture. And the central idea is it shows 12 balloons arranged in 4 tiers. And the idea is that if we want the world to be a better place, we must first of all define what it is we want to do, the goal. And I'm suggesting that we should be seeking to create convivial societies with personal fulfilment within a flourishing biosphere. And we should always keep the goal in mind. And it strikes me that one of the many things with today's governments is they don't actually have a clear idea of what they're trying to achieve, except making lots of money, etc., etc. Point 2 is what is the action that we really need? And I suggested all technologies must be, as it were, appropriate. And appropriate means they should be geared to this end of convivial society and a flourishing biosphere. Otherwise, they're not appropriate. And I also suggest that the principal technologies of all are those of agriculture. We need enlightened agriculture designed to produce good food, and cooking, food culture it's called here. We discussed this morning that you can't have these things. You can't have agriculture that's designed to feed people and a proper food culture and a convivial society, unless you have an appropriate infrastructure. And the appropriate infrastructure means that you have to have the right kind of economy, because everything is mediated via the economy. And you're not going to get a decent economy unless you have a government that is sympathetic to the ideas, which our present government very clearly is not. And you have to get the laws right, and in particular, the law of the land. But, excuse me, I had a nice discussion this morning with Ian about what is primary, what is the thing that really counts. And he was saying what you have to get right is this infrastructure. And that's all very well, because it is, and it's obviously true, but you actually have to get everything right. And the point about the infrastructure is that it is to do with formulae, with methods, algorithms, how you actually do things. And you're never going to get the right algorithms, etc. Well, first of all, you can't run the world on simple algorithms, etc., etc. And lastly, though, you can't get anything at all right unless you have the appropriate mindset. You've got, as they say in modern jargon, to be coming from the right place. And the thing that people don't address enough, in my opinion, is this thing, mindset. And I'm suggesting that the mindset in practice is compounded of 4, what one might call disciplines, areas of discussion. And the first is morality, which of course asks the question, what is it right to do? And the second is what I'm calling here science, which is the study of the material world, basically that, asking the questions, how does the universe work? And therefore ask, how does the world work? And therefore asking the question, what is it possible to do within this world? And what is it necessary to do in order to create convivial societies, etc. Now, science and morality, I suggest, are both rooted in this strange subject known as metaphysics, which literally means beyond physics. And according to some modern thinkers, notably in this case, Saeed Hossein Nasser, who's professor of Islamic studies in Washington, metaphysics is the thing that's gone missing. And metaphysics asks what are called the ultimate questions, which I'll come on to later. But the point is, given that metaphysics has gone missing as an independent discipline, it means we never ask the ultimate questions. And if you don't ask the ultimate questions, you're never going to get anything resembling an answer. And so everything else that we do is kind of adrift because we haven't addressed the most fundamental questions of all. And the last component of the mindset is what I'm loosely calling the arts. And the arts are vital for all kinds of reasons that I'll come on to. Could I have slide 4.1, please, David?
Yep, I'm just going into window 4.1, and then I'll just maximize.
Bottom tier, mindset. This is just summarizes what I just said: science, morality, metaphysics, the arts. I don't know why there's a picture of 5 pigs in the corner, but I didn't make the slides. But, you know, they'll do. They're thinking animals as well, of course. Can we move on to the next one, please?
Right, okay.
Morality.
I just got to go through that, and then it'll go on to the next one, and then I'll put...
Now, when you try to talk about, I want to say that we need a system of morality that is universal. Everybody can subscribe to, everybody in the whole world, and feel comfortable with. And I've often been told that this is, and many people have written, that this is impossible because morality, according to some modern thinkers, is supposed to be relative. You know, different societies have different moral standards, we're told. So what applies in one doesn't apply in another. And in any case, morality is geared to circumstances, etc., etc., etc. What I want to argue is that that's not true. Is that we can envisage something called a universal morality, and that's what I'm trying to work towards, and lots of other people are. A morality that will do for all humanity for all time. If you look historically at the way people have tried to arrive at moral principles, you find that there are three main approaches: utilitarian, deontological, and virtue ethics. Now, utilitarian is what it says. It was summarized really at the end of the 18th century by, what's his name? Oh God, gone right out of my head.
Bentham.
Who?
Jeremy Bentham.
Jeremy Bentham. And he said, you know, that the key to morality, by which he meant utilitarian morality, is the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And that's kind of very 18th century, very kind of rationalist. Morality is seen as something which has definite results, which you can quantify. And isn't it nice to be able to quantify? I reckon the idea that we all need some sort of utilitarian ideas built into moral thinking. But to say that to take it on its own as being the prime source of morality, I think is deeply flawed. And there's several ways of looking at it, really. One is actually the concept of happiness. When I talked about in the first of these sessions, happiness isn't the thing. Happiness is often equated with hedonism, which is a fairly trivial thing. What we should be looking for is fulfilment, which is a very different kind of thing. But we won't discuss that now. But that's one flaw with utilitarianism. It isn't so easy to measure fulfillment. That really does differ from person to person. But the second thing is that if you're purely numerical about it, what matters is what does actually make people happy. And I would give a very simplistic example that if you get, for example, 6 Nazis who beat up one Pole because they don't like Poles, or 6 Hooray Henrys who beat up one tramp because they don't like tramps, you've got 6 happy people and 1 miserable person. But that doesn't seem to be a very good way of judging whether it's a good action or not. What action is one feels in one's bones that nevertheless beating up people you don't like or you don't hold in any account is bad. And the real question is, why do we think beating up people for no good reason is bad, or for any reason come to that? That's the essence of morality, not counting whether people are happy or not. The second approach to morality is deontological, which actually means that you take your lead from some authority figure. Well, if your authority figure is God, and God is conceived as the font of all goodness, then that's a reasonable thing to do. But there's a huge number of people in the world who have claimed to be acting on behalf of God, who behave like all reasonable standards, like complete barbarians. I mean, people slaughter in the name of God. And you have to ask whether you've interpreted the word of God properly, or indeed whether you've gotten on to what the right kind of God. So deontological on its own fails. Even before you get to God, some people make a virtue of the fact that they are simply following the appointed leader. So Nazis made a virtue of the fact that they were doing the Führer's work. But was the Führer's work good, etc.? Nowadays, corporate executives say, well, I'm paid to support the corporate, and therefore that's good. I'm being loyal and doing what I'm doing my duty. That is deontological. But if the corporate is behaving very badly, as some of them do, that's not good. So what is good then? Why do we say things, deontological on its own, not enough, although it's always going to be in there a bit. The third approach, I think, dates sort of in a formal sense from Aristotle, who simply asked the question, what is it? What are the qualities of a good person? And he said, in other words, what are the virtues that we recognize as being the basis of goodness? If I could have the second half of the slide, David. And in fact, lots of people, you could make long lists of virtues, as people like Aristotle did, and lots of other people. But in the end, I think, and I got this from Ramakrishnan, not directly, but thought of, There are three prime virtues which seem to me, or seem to other people, to crop up in all societies and are at the heart of all religions, really, all the bona fide religions. And the first great virtue is that of compassion, a real concern for other people and indeed for other creatures. Interestingly, I mean, people nowadays want to say that people are naturally competitive, naturally and naturally acquisitive, and they're not really capable of compassion. There's an ancient idea which you find, in, for example, in Plato, and you find in Cicero, and you find in Thomas Hobbes, that people left to themselves are rather vicious, and that what you need is strong government imposed by philosophers and educated people and patricians to keep us all in line. I suggest that the exact opposite is the truth, that people are intrinsically compassionate. Compassion is our preferred state. And with compassion goes cooperativeness. And we put cooperative and compassion together, and you have the prime ingredients of conviviality, which is the thing we're trying to achieve. There's a very interesting series of books by Frans de Waal, Dutch biologist, particularly a primatologist, who points out that animals too behave in a way which seems extremely compassionate. I mean, there's many, many anecdotes of animals making real sacrifices in order to protect either their own children, which is not so surprising, but also other members of their own species who they're not related to, and also members of other species that they're not related to. Now, if you're a nasty old, if you're a complete skeptic and a sort of dyed-in-the-wool materialist scientist, you can say, well, they might look as if they're behaving compassionately, but really they're just sort of going through the motions because basically they're machines and they just respond to signals and all that. And that's considered to be terribly hard-nosed and therefore considered to be terribly sort of respectable way of thinking. And after all, science is intrinsically skeptical, and it should be skeptical. It should always be asking whether what appears to be the case really is the case. But you can take skepticism too far, and to say that an animal that appears to be behaving compassionately, that's merely an illusion, and that this is mere anthropomorphism, and therefore bad, is, I think, a very crude way of looking at the world. And very crude way of, I mean, skepticism should not mean cynicism. And a lot of people who think they're hard-nosed are, in fact, not really hard-nosed. They're just cynics, just always questioning, always asking the last question, always failing to disbelieve the best of anything. So I want to argue, as Frans de Waal argues, that compassion is actually deep in our nature. It's not something unique to human beings, even, or something that is imposed by culture. It is in our biology, and it's the opposite. It's the ruthlessness and the competitiveness and the acquisitiveness that are the cultural impositions. And we can bring out the trick is to bring out the compassion in ourselves. The second great virtue, which has been identified by all the great religions, etc., is that of humility. And humility doesn't only mean personal humility, being humble in the face of, towards other people. It also means being humble in the face of nature, for all humanity to be humbled by the sheer enormity of or the enormousness of the natural world. But it also means being humble in the face of ideas, because we have this terrible notion in the modern world, some intellectuals always have, that we're capable of understanding things exhaustively and with certainty, and that on the basis of this understanding, we can more or less do what we like. We've sort of got godlike status. And this is what the old Greeks call hubris, and hubris, which effectively means usurping the power of the gods. And the old Greeks thought that hubris was the greatest sin and the greatest folly of all. And I think they're right. And the modern world, the modern sort of approach to the natural world and to other societies is one of extreme hubris, and that's one prime reason why we're in such a mess. And the third of the great virtues is an attitude of reverence towards the natural world. And I think we need to restore, if you want to keep the natural world in good heart, first of all, you do need to be a good ecologist. You do need to understand as far as you can how it works, how the world works. And you do need to be able to apply that knowledge, through conservation and all that kind of thing. But knowledge on its own is not enough. You actually have to care. You have to have a sense that the natural world really matters. And you don't have a sense that it really matters, I think, without this sense of reverence. And the sense of reverence is rooted in the end in the sense of the sacred. And we have lost the sense of the sacred. Can we go on to the, it seems to me that if we bear in mind the three prime virtues, these really do apply to all societies and for all time. They really can be the basis of good behavior for all human beings. And if we only give ourselves a chance, they are embedded within us. So we can't, we're halfway there, but we need to do the other half. Anyway, that is the idea of the universal morality, one of the great components of the mindset. Can we move on to the next slide, please, David? The second one, I think we've got round up here, is, hang on, I'm out of order. Not that it matters because I can look at the screen. Science, here we are. There are lots of things to remember about science. The first is that the impression is given, not least by people like Dawkins and so on and so on and so on, that, and by lots of modern scientists, that science is, as people might say, the royal road to truth. There's a deeply embedded idea that science can tell us, first of all, everything there is to know, and secondly, that it can tell us things with complete certainty. And I've got some good quotes here that make that kind of point in my book. This is by Rudolf Carnap, 1891 to 1970, who was one of the founding fathers of logical positivism at the beginning of the 20th century. And he simply said, there is no question whose answer is in principle unobtainable by science. No question. The way the logical positivists actually proceeded was entirely tautological, because they said any question that we can't answer or any question that science can't answer is a non-question and is nonsense and should therefore not be asked at all, which is, well, you can't go wrong if you say that kind of thing, can you? This has, what's his name? Carnap was writing 100 years ago, but much more recently, in the 80s, Peter Atkins, who is actually quite a nice chap, who is professor of chemistry in Oxford, and he wrote, there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Only the religious, among whom I include not only the prejudiced, but also the underinformed, hope there is a dark corner of the universe, or of the universe of experience, that science can never hope to illuminate. In other words, we can tell you everything there is to know or worth knowing in the fullness of time. I'd like to contrast that with a comment by Einstein, I think written in the 1930s. In fact, it was written in the 1930s. Einstein, in my view, was a great metaphysician, besides being a great scientist. And his comment was, the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious, the fundamental emotion, which is the cradle of time and true science. In other words, there are some scientists, including the very greats, who don't believe that science tells us everything we should know. It seems to me that there are 3 or 4 key people in the 20th century who sort of knocked science off its perch, despite what the logical positivists were trying to say. And one of those was Kurt Gödel, German, I think it's German, it might have been Austrian, mathematician, who pointed out that that science, mathematics is always taken as being infallible, because well, it is infallible within its own terms, but and science is rooted in mathematics, no question. I remember interviewing Joseph Needham, one of the great philosophers of science, and of science indeed, in the 20th century, who defined science as the ruthless mathematization of ideas. But Gödel pointed out that maths is nothing like so certain and complete as people like to think it is. And he not only asserted, but actually demonstrated, proved that it's impossible to be certain and complete and consistent all at the same time. All complex mathematical statements contain arbitrary inventions, really, which you can't actually demonstrate are true. And once you say that maths itself is not quite the rock solid certainty that one took it to be, it sort of rather undermines the claim of science to be the sort of complete, certain thing that it pretends to be. The second blow, I think, was struck primarily by Karl Popper, beginning in the 1930s, who simply asserted and showed that you can't really prove anything in science. People like to talk about proof. Well, you can prove mathematical formulae, if you agree your terms before you start, but you can't really prove beyond all possible doubt any real statement about the state of the real world. He said what you can do with a scientific hypothesis, theoretically you can disprove it. So that he defined a scientific hypothesis as opposed to religious or some other hypothesis as an idea that could in principle be falsified. But once you say we can't really prove things, you can only show that they are, with certainty, that they are false. You've undermined, again, this claim that science can be omniscient and tell us everything with absolute certainty. And the third, I think, idea that sort of knocks science off the sort of 18th century Peter Atkins type perch is the idea of Thomas Kuhn, that really, putting it in a nutshell, everything we know about the universe is a story in the end. And science is a story like any other. It isn't actually a story quite like any other because science does have special features. It is mathematical, which is important, and its ideas are falsifiable and explicit and so on, which is very important. Science is wonderful. My own background is in science, but it is, in the end, it's a story, and we can't simply say because it's a scientific statement, it is therefore true and wonderful. And I think the fourth blow was struck by one of the great scientists, one of the great biologists of the 20th century, Sir Peter Medawar, who in the 1960s simply declared in the title of an essay, "Science is the art of the soluble." And in other words, scientists only attack those problems that they think they are capable of answering within a given time with the methods that they've actually got. Now that makes science as a whole a giant tautology, because the reason that scientists can feel as confident as they do is because they're only addressing the questions that they know they can answer or they think they can answer in the fullness of time. And to define truth as that which science can solve is kind of, well, it's wishful thinking in the extreme. Now, the process by which people, I mean, the phenomenon, the idea that science can solve all problems and tell us everything there is to know about the universe is known as scientism, which should be distinct from science itself. And scientism in turn gives rise to this terrible thing, technological, uncritical technophilia. Out of science comes all these high technologies. And if you believe that science is omniscient, you can start to believe that all the problems of the world can be solved by the products of science, i.e. by high tech. And that another is, again, a hugely dangerous idea. And I suggested in the first session that if you put uncritical technophilia together with the economic idea of neoliberalism, which says that everything has to have a price and we all have to compete to make the most money and so on, you are in a very dangerous world indeed. And that's the world we're in. Belief in high tech and believe that we can solve all our problems just by competing to make more and more money, and so on and so on. So that's science. It is wonderful, it is necessary, but it is not the answer to all our problems. It has to be placed in a larger context. And the last point is that science at the moment, and a kind of science I was taught in the 1950s and 60s, is basically very sort of scientistic. In other words, people who teach science tend to concentrate on its material strengths. Science is taught as if its job was to produce high technologies, and as if the job of high technologies was to produce more money, and as if it can in fact answer our problems, or at least as if its ideas should be considered to be supreme. Now, I want to suggest that way back in the 17th century, when modern science was first getting off the ground, scientists, the great scientists, Newton, Leibniz, and some of them were more philosophers than scientists, but Leibniz, Descartes, Galileo, certainly Galileo, John Ray, the biologist, Robert Boyle, the chemist and physicist, they were all of them deeply devout. And to them, science was a way of trying to understand the mind of God. And they had the same attitude towards science that Bach had, J.S. Bach had towards music. J.S. Bach said, all my music is dedicated to God, and they effectively, the scientists dedicated their science to God. And that idea disappeared in the 18th century, the same century that Bach was composing in, obviously, but it sort of disappeared largely during the course of the Enlightenment and carried on disappearing during the 19th and 20th centuries. But I think that old idea should be reinstated. The science shouldn't be treated as a sort of purely material thing for solving our problems or for solving our material, our economic problems, but should be solved, but should be taught basically as an exercise in not of controlling the world, not of bullying the world, but of appreciating the world. And to borrow 17th century language, basically as a tribute to the wonders of the natural world. That's how it should be taught. Can we go on to the next slide, please, David? Metaphysics, in my humble opinion, what's his name? Nasser Hussain, Said Hussain. Nasser Hussain Said. The trouble with these chaps is they all have the same name arranged in different permutations, so I tend to get them confused. Anyway, the professor of Islamic science at Washington, he says that metaphysics answers life's ultimate questions. The word metaphysics etymologically means beyond physics. The questions you start to ask when you've done all the science that you can reasonably do. And to me, he doesn't define what the ultimate questions are, but I suggest that the ultimate questions are, there should be 4 things up here. There's only 2 so far, but that's...
Okay, sorry, I'll just keep going.
Yeah.
Didn't realize you had a second column.
That's right. Let's have the second column as well.
And is that it, or is another one?
One at the bottom. Yeah.
That's it, I think.
Isn't there one at the bottom that says, how come?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
To me, the ultimate questions are, what is the universe really like? What is the basis of goodness? Not simply asking what is good, as moral philosophers do, but why do we have an idea of goodness at all? Thirdly, how do we know what's true? Philosophers claim this for their own, but so do metaphysicians. And the 4th big question is, how come? Briefly, what is the universe really like? Well, people who are sort of not so much scientists as scientistic like to say this question can be answered absolutely by science, but science, of course, deals only with what's soluble, and that primarily means it deals only with the material universe. Now, can we reasonably claim that the material universe, which is the only bit we can really study well, is all there is? To make that claim, that's an enormous and hubristic leap, I would say. We don't know whether the material universe is all there is. And the metaphysician takes a broader view and says, actually, we should consider the possibility that there's a lot going on in the universe which is not of a material kind, can't be measured, isn't therefore immediately susceptible to science, and can't can't therefore be pinned down by science. And that is the idea that I and a lot of other people are calling transcendence, the idea that there is a transcendent reality behind what is visible. Pretty big, pretty obvious idea, but I would say that the metaphysician is more broadly thinks more broadly than, as it were, the mere scientist, and that the idea of transcendence is one of the key ideas of metaphysics in response to this first question: what's the universe really like? It seems to me too, and to a lot of other people, that there is now a meeting place between the metaphysics and proper science or real science in the notion of universal consciousness. And the notion of universal consciousness says that consciousness, which I'm prepared to equate with mind, although other people don't, is not something that emanates or originates in our own head and emanates from our own heads. It is something that is a quality of the universe. And we don't simply generate consciousness within our own heads, we partake of what is already out there, like radio receivers. We then modify within our own heads and pass on, and thus transmit as well as receiving, and thus contribute to the universal consciousness. But there's a lot of evidence from physics that universal consciousness is a good idea. And I like to quote, there's lots of people I quoted in my book, but one of them is Edison, who said the basic stuff of the universe should be called mind stuff. In other words, consciousness and material stuff are both in there. And they furthermore are dependent upon each other. They are two sides of the same coin, rather like Einstein's concept of space-time. So that's the first great concept of metaphysics, which makes it different from other ways of thinking. The second is the big idea of oneness, and the idea that we are all things in the universe, and particularly all living things, are in fact one, and we are aspects of this oneness. Like that idea, the idea of universal consciousness is obviously very compatible with the idea of oneness. There's a third fundamental idea, which I haven't got on this slide for some reason, and that is the idea of mystery. And I'd like to quote Einstein again, except that I think I've lost. No, I will just quote Einstein again, who said, well, I'll tell you what he said. He said, there is no finer emotion than the sense of mystery. And that's one of the great scientists who's supposed to be explaining how the world works. So I'd say transcendence, wonders, mystery. If you ask the question, what is the basis of goodness, as opposed simply to what is good, you can't, it's very difficult to sort of intellectualize about this. You have to go to deep religious, metaphysical concepts and take them at their face value, I think. But the idea I really like is the idea of the Dharma, the Buddhist version of the Dharma, which simply says that the universe is fundamentally harmonious. And then you can say there's a universal harmony. And then you can say what is good is what contributes to the universal harmony. Conviviality is obviously part of that. But also what is bad is what detracts from the universal harmony. And strife, etc., obviously are part of that. Then we ask the question, how do we know what's true? For the third of the sort of ultimate questions. And the sort of ultra-rationalists of the modern age, they say, well, it's all done with the intellect, it's all done with rationality. Actually, not so. And I've got to cut down because Ruth is reminding me that I'm running out of time. But I want to say that even the most rational of rationalists are kidding themselves if they think that they have arrived at their ideas by rationality alone. And the guy that illustrates this for me is James Watson, who is very, very hard-nosed character, doesn't, a real cynic, let alone skeptic. And he was one of the co-discoverers of the three-dimensional structure of DNA, founders of modern molecular biology. And in the end, why do you believe, people say, why do you believe that your double helix model is true? And he said something that beautiful cannot be, must be true. And that's rather wonderful, I think. And then there was Paul Dirac, one of the great physicists and mathematicians of the English of the 20th century, who said, always look for beauty in your equations. And it's beauty that sort of finally consolidates in your mind the idea that one particular idea is true because it just feels right and another isn't. It's summarized by Keats: beauty is truth, truth is beauty. That is all you need to know. But it's a feeling in the bones that tells us what's true, not the kind of rational demonstration. And the final question is, how come? And the point there is that however much you can explain the universe by physics and good biology and so on, you're always left with the question, how come? How could it possibly be so? Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? These are that's the really big question. And that is unanswerable, but it's a question one should never lose sight of. I know I'm running out of time, David, but can I run on to the next one? Here, nice quote from William James in the third of his Gifford lectures given in Edinburgh in 1901, which appears in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And this is about the fact that metaphysics is really at the heart of all religions. So he says, in its broadest terms, religion says that there is an unseen order, and that our supreme goal lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. It's a wonderful summary, I think, of what metaphysics is really about, the idea that there is an unseen order. I wonder too, particularly in the context of Parry, what is the relationship between this unseen order and the, what's it called, the implicate order described by David Bohm and in conversation also with David Peat. The two ideas seem very similar. They must be related. I'd like to see a discussion of one day about that by people that know more than I do. Can we just have the penultimate slide, David? This shows the idea that whereas all great religions are different, they all share this metaphysical core. They all have the idea of transcendence and the idea of oneness and the idea of in the end, of mystery. They emphasize different things to different extents, but they've all got that. And they've all got a morality based on the idea of compassion and humility and reverence for the natural world. They all translate these things differently, but as you can see from the sort of petals around the outside of the flower, but they all have this shared core. And it's the fact that they have this shared core, I think, that means that the idea of, for example, of interfaith becomes possible. There should be a dialogue between all these great religions, each putting their own spin on these central ideas. And the idea that there should be some kind of battle between them is nonsense. And I'll go on to my last slide, which is just to introduce the arts. And the point about the arts is that they are, to me, they're the joker in the pack. However clever you might think you are, however great your ideas may be, the artist will come along and say, what about this? What about that? And have a different view of how the world really is. They don't have to have a different view. They can simply ask you to appreciate better what is before you. But they are basically the sort of the joke. Well, as I say, the jokers in the pack. This particular picture I just happen to like. Peter Bruegel is spelt wrongly. Peter should have an I in it, and Bruegel has got an E in it at the end rather than an A. But leave that aside. This is Bruegel's picture of the harvesters painted in the 16th century, round about 1570. This shows another aspect of the arts that, as it were, without trying, they show you what's going on in the world in a way that you just don't get from just reading histories or just looking at archaeology. And what we've got here, obviously, is a lot of peasants. Let's assume it's in Germany. And they're harvesting what I think is probably wheat, although conceivably it could be rye. Illustrates several points. First of all, that agriculture traditionally was very labor intensive. And also that the laborers weren't just slaves, they were skilled people. And here they are using scythes, which to use efficiently is not that easy. And especially with an old-fashioned scythe, quite difficult to keep it sharp. Anyway, so that illustrates the nature of agriculture in those days, but also, most interestingly, which is why I like to show it in an agricultural context, note that the plant, the cereal, which I take to be wheat, is shoulder high. In fact, it's almost head high on some of these chaps. And partly this is because peasants in those days were fairly short, but also because wheat is biologically, naturally, a very tall plant, something like 4'6" long. Furthermore, the straw is very, very stiff. Otherwise, it wouldn't be standing up like that. And there it is standing up in the stooks. And of course, the straw in this form, in this strong form, is very useful and was the basis of thatching, which you can't, modern wheat straw you can't use for that. Now, modern wheats are about half this height. They're about knee height. And the reason for that is that a knee high, a tall straw like this, a tall wheat like this, puts a huge amount of its energy into making straw, as opposed to making grain at the top. And the modern varieties do it the other way around. They make lots of grain and not much straw. And furthermore, with the modern varieties, you can whack on loads and loads of fertilizer, and they will give you most ridiculous yields, like 8 tons a hectare in Britain, as opposed to 1 or 2 tons a hectare max if you grow these old things by traditional ways. But the very, very productive wheats, modern wheats, are also very, very susceptible to disease and to weeds. They're overgrown by weeds, and they are very susceptible to pests because they're so genetically uniform. And the only way you can keep modern wheats going is by whacking on loads of, the only way you can make them worthwhile is by whacking on loads of fertilizer. And the only way you can keep them safe is by whacking on loads of pesticide and fungicide. So this illustrates what old-fashioned wheat used to be like, as opposed to the modern kind, which is a nice kind of historical insight into how life used to be. It isn't very profound, but it's a nice picture, and that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Colin. That was very interesting, very interesting. You've introduced, great mindset to universal morality based on values, being aware of the limits of science, having an alive and unifying metaphysics, and of course, showed the power of the arts. With that, we'll move on to Ruby, who has something to tell us.
Thank you so much, Colin. It's really a pleasure to be in conversation with you again. I've been so inspired by your work, and particularly the way that you bring together many ideas in a very holistic approach, and a systemic approach. And I see this topic of mindset as a really key component of that. And as time goes on, I'm realizing more and more that things only make sense when you look at them holistically and systemically. look at the interrelationships between cause and effect, rather than just how to treat the effect and allow the cause to remain unfettered, which is what contemporary culture tends to do so well. My sister and I started our own organization, Advaya, about 6 years ago, based in this holistic approach. And since then, we've organized over 250 different events, courses, and programs, whether online or in the flesh, that explore the interrelationships between ecology, or understood as the health of the natural living world, community, as in health of human relationships, society, economy, and cultural activity, and spirituality, understood as how we view the world around us, how we're able to connect with something more than ourselves. And each of these relate intrinsically to one another, and also to the categories of your book, Colin: infrastructure, action, and mindset. On the topic of mindset, I've been really inspired by the work of Riane Eisler, who speaks about the partnership domination continuum. At one end of the spectrum, there's the domination model that defines the culture of the modern world and economy. And at the other end is the partnership model. The partnership model is life-supporting, and it aligns with cultures of interrelationship, partnership, and mutually beneficial relationships. It reflects the principles of the natural living world and sits at the heart of traditional science, societies, and many of the world religions. The domination model, in contrast, is defined by hierarchy and power over. It values strength, power, accumulation, linear progress, competition, and wealth. It defines the dominant culture and growth-based economy of the world today. The culture of corporate globalized capitalism, colonization, competition, extractivism, ecological destruction, patriarchy, and so on. They're all the same thing. I find it quite helpful to look through the lens of gender studies, because a domination paradigm is imbued with power based around labor, decision-making, and social hierarchy. There are associations of masculine strength and feminine weakness, which has a major impact on how society functions. We can all see how violence is rooted in these relationships of domination: gender violence, environmental violence, racial violence, religious violence, class violence. Then there is the political appeal of this kind of aggressive masculinity, which lies in fear of losing certain privileges, because people vote for people like Trump or Bolsonaro because they fear decision-making going into the hands of those who are seen as weak. So it can be a binary approach of strength versus weakness, masculine versus feminine, left versus right, east versus west, which marginalizes a majority and can lead to dogmatic thinking and fundamentalism and ideological warfare. I think we're really seeing this in quite a scary way in the world today, particularly in the realms of social media, where algorithms are making our echo chambers smaller and smaller, repeating the same narratives over and over and over again to create very compounded viewpoints and very lack of critical thinking and a real lack of debate. And there's an extraction of empathy from that construct. And I find, and it's often done in the name of morality. And that's what I love so much, Colin, about when you talk about morality, and it's underpinned by humility and compassion, because I feel that the morality, when things are done in the name of morality, without that, they're extremely dangerous. And morality before otherwise is so tied, Colin, as you mentioned, to cultural context and a value-based system. And things are done in the name of the common good that are far from it. And likewise, when it comes to religion, where a lot of morality is grounded in religion, the root of religion, religare, meaning to bind. In a domination paradigm, we're bound to hierarchy. But in a partnership paradigm, you're bound to other life systems and other life, and you're supporting the health of that other life. Institutionalized religion in a domination paradigm becomes stripped of its compassion and empathy, and increasingly attached to this dogmatic thinking. Science, likewise, as Colin was talking about, becomes dogmatic and institutionalized, even dangerous. The irony of scientific skepticism that doesn't ask questions about itself. Rupert Sheldrake recently brought to my attention the quote of Terence McKenna, which I thought was brilliant, so I'll say it here. He says, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. The one free miracle is the appearance of all the mass and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it in a single instant from nothing, which I think is quite funny and very typical of Terence McKenna. But science ultimately is a methodology. And I love, Colin, how you speak about how science should be a method to explore and understand the world and allow us to think beyond our current understanding. And that really goes down again to this idea of dogmatic thinking, which is really defining our times now, where we're not asking questions and we're not looking deeper, and things become very violent. Thinking about globalization, for example, or the deregulation of trade and finance in order to enable businesses and banks to operate globally, and the way that globalization operates through corporate rule, free trade, international development, subsidies, and debt-backed finance. This is unethical also. Governments have been subsidizing and supporting large companies to the detriment of small and local businesses in the name of a single world market. Corporate-funded think tanks and media outlets often talk about this being done in the name of common good again. But the reality is quite far from that. There's a massive loss of livelihoods, environmental breakdown, lack of resilience, erosion of democracy, wealth gap, blah, blah, blah. Goes on. So humans have a very flexible brain, which is wonderful, but it also makes us susceptible to our environments and contexts. So to shift to a world of mutually beneficial relationships, we really have to pay attention to our culture and what is presented to us as human nature, as truth and as reality. And again, Colin, I liked how you spoke about truth in that way, because it's very hard to define truth, because it's, again, always related to what you understand. So if we understand the world as suffering from a crisis of culture, and it's that sits at the root of the ecological and social crises of today. So it's not climate change, it's the culture that's creating the climate change. So even environmental narratives can fall foul of this idea of kind of binary thinking as well. For the concept of the Anthropocene that sees humanity as a virus, or this idea that humans and nature have to be kept apart from each other. I think that also isn't always so helpful, because humans and nature have co-evolved together, been interdependent to each other. Like many indigenous tribes now are being taken away from their lands in the name of conservation. And so there's this, and Colin, also in your book, you talk a lot about how the most biodiverse places are where humans and nature are together. And it's only our system that's preventing this from happening. So it's all a matter of narrative and story, which you also say, Colin. And having been told these false stories, we need to change our worldview to be more aligned with the reality of the world that we're dealing with, which is an interconnected world of relationships. So we can be independent and realize our full potential as individuals, but at the same time understand the power of connection. We can build societies and cultures rooted in this partnership idea, and it requires us to really connect the dots. And now the world is in crisis and there's so much changing, but it could go in either direction. And when it comes to transforming mindset, I love, Colin, how you speak about consciousness and metaphysics, because I don't think that we need to debate metaphysics necessarily, or that we have to be asking those big questions. But I think we have to provide the space and the opportunity for people to have a connection to something that's much more than themselves, to connect to deeper senses of consciousness through a culture that celebrates the beauty of nature, that encourages practices and such as spirituality or meditation, and that supports these other ways of being that aren't always just in relationship to kind of intellectual development or other things that may be valued. And I think this level of practice and direct experience is really important to help us to embody these ideas of connection, and this idea of partnership and interrelationship. Because it's never really enough just to intellectually understand something. There's a huge gap between education and change, or education and action. But I think if education and understanding are joined by direct experience, and then faith and belief, it gives you hope. And Colin, you also spoke about hope in your first talk, and I agree that this is so important. And because when you have hope accompanied by faith, then you can change your mindset, and then you can open up on much greater vistas of possibility. This allows vision and imagination. And from there, you can have direction and action. And that creates the narrative change that we need, the change in policy, culture, and behavior. So I should probably stop there. But I just feel, just to end this on this idea of vision and imagination, a lot of the time now, current narratives are talking about the world ending. You see sci-fi movies in the future and this awful picture of the future. And I think sometimes we do just go to the image of the future we have as a direction that we take. So it's how can we really imagine these beautiful futures of life-supporting societies in harmony with the natural world, in harmony with one another, and how can we rethink all of these structures that we're currently living by that aren't serving us and aren't taking us to that future. So I just would end on that, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Ruby, for that. That was incredibly powerful, everything you've said, and it highly resonated with me, definitely, and I hope with everyone else. One aspect actually that I found very interesting that doesn't really come up in these circles is what you said at the beginning, the importance of gender studies in this topic, because you are right. All these neoliberalism, capitalism, all these systems are based on this masculine energy, all about power, competition, being in first place and regardless of everyone else. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And yeah, thank you for that. I guess now we should move to breakaway rooms, which will be followed by a 5-minute break. I believe that we have some sort of questions prepared for everyone, sort of something to think about during the breakaway rooms. Colin and Ruby, do you want to share these questions?
You want to do what?
The questions for the breakaway rooms.
Well, one question I thought was quite interesting is do people actually agree that metaphysics should be restored to the center stage or not? I understand Ruby possibly doesn't, but that's fine. But that's my question.
Yeah. And Ruby, did you have anything to as a question?
Maybe how could we change our mindset, or how could we change our cultural narratives?
Okay, great. Well, you should get the invitation soon. The breakaway rooms should last about 10 minutes. So see you all at 1:15. So yes, hopefully everyone had a good discussion during the breakaway rooms. I know this discussion was very interesting. So yes, let's move to questions. Again, to ask a question, use the raise your hand function on Zoom, which can be found in the reactions at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're shy, you can ask your question through the chat. Who wants to start with questions? Peter. Peter Fenwick, do you have a question?
He's just unmuting himself.
Oh, okay.
Colin.
Long time if you're in Scotland, you see.
Colin, lovely to see you, and I really enjoyed your talk very much. You've given us so much to think about that I'm feeling really rather overwhelmed by this great rethink that we've got to do. Colin, I am a government agent, and I give you 2 things and all the money you want to do them. What are you going to choose, and where are you going to start?
It's a very good question.
Colin needs to unmute.
Colin's on mute. Colin, you're on mute.
There we go.
I would actually, Peter, where are we? Do something very sort of conventional and obvious, which is to get our college really moving, because it does seem to me that it's the rethinking it's got to happen. It may not happen first, but it's got to happen. And there aren't many institutions in the world that are really trying to get across all the ideas that really need to be got across. And if I really had endless money, I would certainly try and make a bigger attack on agriculture, because as I said in my first talk, in a sense, you can focus everything you want to do on agriculture. You get agriculture right, everything else can become right. And that doesn't necessarily mean it will, but it can. And if you don't get agriculture right, nothing else will work. On the other hand, in order to get agriculture right, you have to get everything else to work as well, including the economy and the way you govern the country and etc., the science. So it's a wonderful focal point for thinking about everything that really needs to be thought about. And I reckon if we got ourselves, I love, yeah, I would recreate Dartington basically, but sort of different. But it's a good model.
Yes.
Harry is a model too, of course. But it needs 1,000 acres of stuff to work with. Anyway, carry on. Sorry.
Colin, that's great. But another Dartington isn't going to produce the change and the sweep that you want. Now, you've got a lot of money. What are you going to do to get us to change? You say change agriculture. What are you going to change? How?
Well, I don't think, well, we come back to the point that real change can't happen just from the top. It has to happen.
Absolutely.
So one thing I think is absolutely vital is community action. I really do believe in communities, because communities can do what individuals can't, but at the same time, they're not swept along unless they want to be by international politics and corporate thinking and all that stuff. So I would spend a lot of money and time encouraging corporate communities to happen. I always say that, said in the governance talk, that what governments should do is to encourage good things to happen. And actually, they don't on the whole. They largely encourage bad things to happen. So I would have an institution that encouraged good things to happen.
I think that is really wonderful. So what we would have are Tudge envoys going around and setting up communities. And I think that'd be really great. Thank you, Colin.
Well, I think they'd also have to have the right mindset, you see. I mean, because, Colin, as Colin himself said, if you just tinker around with agriculture without looking at the mentality and worldview and philosophy that informs it, which is extractive and exploitative and maximize sustainable yield and large scale, everything that we've been trying to think about reversing over this seminar, and which Ruby also mentioned, which is embedded in a dominator model, as Rian Eisler would say. So it's radical in the sense that we actually have to pull our current culture up by the roots and then have a replant.
Incidentally, I would sort of half take, I'm a great fan of Ian Rappel, who was on this morning, which is why I asked him to do this, of course, but he really does believe in the idea of revolution. We're not going to change anything without revolution. I've been pushing Renaissance, meaning literally rebirth, and revolutions as normally and the result of Renaissance is actually revolutionary. In other words, it's radical, it gets down to the roots. It's revolutionary in the sense that we need a 180-degree switch in the way we think about things and the way we do things. But the method is not revolutionary if you can avoid it. For the reasons I sort of sketch out in the book, that all politics is non-linear in its effects, which basically means you don't know how it's going to turn out because there are so many factors you don't understand, etc. But revolution is non-linear in spades. And I suggest that very few actual physical type uprisings leading to revolution have ever worked out the way that it's the protagonists, the supporters wanted. And I don't believe, for example, that the chaps in 1917 who brought about the Russian Revolution seriously envisaged that they'd have 30 years of Stalin. That wasn't what they were going to do. And the Arab Spring, full of hope a few years ago, completely reversed now. And so it goes on. It very rarely turns out the way you want it to. And the other thing that happens is that what we need is a total, as everyone's been saying, total shift in mindset away from the competitiveness to the cooperativeness and so on. But what revolutions tend to be in practice is a competition between one group and another group, and you replace one power group with another power group. That's not what we're trying to do at all. So revolution in effect, but Renaissance in method. And of course, it was Gandhi more than anybody who spelled out what Renaissance involves, which is just doing what you think is the right thing to do, despite the powers that be. And if enough people do it, with luck, you win eventually.
There's a nice quotation, Colin, which you'll know from E.F. Schumacher. He said, "People call me a crank, but a crank is a useful tool that performs revolutions."
Johnny good.
Yeah.
Clever, that Schumacher. Sorry.
No, I just, I mean, I thought that Peter's question was very important. I wanted also to hear what Ruby would do. You know, what's the first step for this great rethink?
I would do something similar to Colin by relocalizing community and relocalizing local economy. That's what I would do. So relocalizing food systems, food economy, the shops to be in the local area, educate the schools to be in the local area. And I think that would enable people to connect again, the impact of the kind of, I don't know, I think relocalization is the way, and that would be my first thing.
This would be ideal for the Tudge envoys, wouldn't it?
I'd just like to add an example, which I think is relevant to what we're talking about. This came from the International Futures Forum and the work that we did with Falkirk Council. And what Falkirk Council did is originally they produced a 5-year plan, which they then sent out to everybody so that they could discuss it. And this was a top-down centralized document. And of course, nobody paid any attention to it at all. But once they started organizing community groups to come up with their own ideas to complement or add to what they had proposed from the center, the whole thing took off. And so people, I think, are ready to come together, to talk, to take action. But that, as Colin's been saying, this needs to be enabled by the people who can actually help and then provide facilities, cups of tea, a bit of support, and maybe the odd glass of wine as well wouldn't go astray.
I think as well with a concentrated community and with a revalorization of community values and community relationships, you immediately become more accountable, and there's a greater sense of responsibility as well, because your actions have impacts. Whereas right now, your actions don't really have much impact because you're so separate. The cause and the effect is so separate and distances are so long and far. Your food comes from the other side of the world. You vote, but it feels like your vote doesn't count for much. Whereas if you have small government policies relating to small regions led by small governments specific to a place, then each part of that community has a role to play in its future and will feel that too. So that on that topic, that's, I think, quite an important part.
Don't you think the transition town movement isn't that already the kind of initiative that we're looking for?
Yeah, transition towns movement, and also Helena Norberg Hodge is doing amazing work in this as well, through local futures. One of her main tools is the farmers market, which I think is really powerful. And she kind of has created a lot of farmers markets in Australia, where she's living now. And I was there last year, and it was really amazing to see that revitalization of community that was taking place in those regions, and how many local producers were springing up everywhere. So I found that really inspiring.
Can I throw in a couple of anecdotes that illustrate the kind of psychology of people at large? And one has to do with a chap I talked to about 30 years ago about population control, which was the term that was quite acceptable 30 years ago. It isn't now. But he was talking about the need for contraception and the fact that actually people want it. It's not something you had to force down their throats. But he said when the government, I can't remember what country, but it was in the East, tried to impose contraceptives on the population, they absolutely resisted. They said absolutely not. But the way they actually did it in the end, I don't know who came up with this, was to make them illegal. And they could only be obtained on the black market. And once you could only obtain them on the black market, they went like hotcakes. I mean, it's a true story, although I can't remember the details. And I remember another example. I was writing a book actually about Mendel, and the local aristocrat, who was a tremendous philanthropist, wanted to introduce new varieties of fruit, of apples, to the local community because they were better. I mean, bigger and juicier and grew better and all that. And the way she did it was to put round the idea that anybody who stole her apples or tried to take cuttings from her trees would be seriously dealt with. And she put guards on, to make sure that people keep the people out. But the guards were under strict instructions not actually to arrest anybody. So everybody swarmed in and pinched the stuff and went like wildfire. Just threw that in.
Nicely paradoxical.
Yes.
Make something illegal, it immediately becomes desirable.
Yeah.
They say in Yorkshire, there's not so queer as folk. Good example of non-linearity.
Great. Are there any other questions that you'd like to ask our speakers? Again,
I was wondering what had come up in the breakout rooms and whether there's any theme there that we should be taking up.
yes, if anyone wants to share what was said during these breakout rooms, feel free to, and see if it creates a discussion.
Yes. I wouldn't mind returning to this business of religion and definitions thereof. And I wonder whether with a thing like that, an idea like that, it's actually useful to define them too closely. Certainly whether it's useful to try to define them on etymological grounds. I mean, they are as they are, and have been with us for thousands of years. And it seems to me that the most useful way to get to grips with them is not to try to define them in a sort of a priori way, but to describe them as succinctly as you can. And that's why I quite like I very much like William James's attempt to define it. Well, it doesn't try to define it, it just says in its broadest terms, religion simply says there is an unseen order and that our supreme goal lies in harmoniously adjusting to it. That's jolly good. I like the idea, and I've written about here and there, that what religions, all bona fide religions, as opposed to cults, try to do is to provide human beings with a complete narrative. Given that, we all need a narrative by which to work, what we take to be important, what we take to be true. And religions try to do that. They do have a metaphysical component, a metaphysical core. In reality, most religions, certainly Christianity and Islam, have a very strong historical thread, trying to tell us what happened in the past and how we got to be the way we are on a cosmic scale in the case of Christianity and Judaism, but obviously also in sociological terms. And they try to define what we should actually do. They try to impose, or not impose, but to suggest a morality. And I like the idea of religion as being the complete account of all that you really need to know and should know to get through this life, or I would say to create convivial societies, etc. Some people would say, no, the real point of religion is to get to heaven and all that stuff. But, people define goals differently, but that's what I think religion is.
Well, you could say the kingdom of God is the desirable state for Christianity.
You could say what, sorry?
The kingdom of God. I mean, this is a kingdom of justice and goodness and
Yeah, yeah.
But it's aspirational, obviously. We're not anywhere near it at the moment. I can see Alan has come in, and he was here this morning and didn't have a chance to ask his question.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alan. You're muted at the moment. Should be in the bottom left of your screen.
Right.
There we go.
No, I just want to make the point that all religions seem to have started, whether it was Christ or Muhammad or some other initiator of a religion, they seem to have started by hearing voices, which psychiatrists, of course, would consider madness. So I think metaphysics is very important. And we have, there's a whole area which is entirely neglected by scientists, which is, of course, science is based on materialism. So if we can get beyond materialism, and I think we're getting beyond that in the Galileo Commission, focusing on a deeper knowledge of consciousness, then we shall make some progress. But I agree with you, Colin. I think it's very important, metaphysics. We need to explore there.
Indeed. I remember Peter Fenwick saying 30, 40 years ago, the problem of consciousness was the great problem of the world, really, of the modern world.
I think he still thinks that, but with a different non-dual hat on these days.
Yes, I still feel that's absolutely true. I think we're coming in for a revolution in consciousness. More people are becoming non-dual, and with it, their thinking changes. Once you really realize that the ego is not driving you, then you have much more opportunity. But with the giving up of the ego, of course, you become part of the universe. Now, what's the use of a large, huge yacht if you're part of the universe? It just doesn't make sense. And so I think that a change in consciousness, which we're all going through now, is amazing. It really is. We had a grandson up here this weekend, and taking him as modern thinking, he knows, he just visiting the web, the amount of information which we didn't have any access to at all. I mean, a lot of the things that you were saying, Colin, are all there on the web, the kids are getting. And so I think this is impacting back on their level of understanding and consciousness. You only need a telephone for it, nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation about consciousness is a very important one, not only about, changing consciousness, changing our paradigms about how we think, but also the deeper question, what is consciousness? Which, bit of self-advertising here, we will be discussing this later in June at the Barry Center at the What is Consciousness conference. But yes, we have a couple of hands up, which I think are mostly in response to what we're talking about. I think Walter had his hand up first.
Okay, that's me, yes. First, Colin, thank you very much. These 2 Saturdays have been like refreshing my blood with a lot of oxygenium and my spirit too. Somehow it was like a wonderful medical treatment of all my being. Yeah. Just before the breakout, there have been 2 questions. One was from you, Colin. You wanted to give us the question, the importance of metaphysics. And Ruby, she said the reset of our mindset. And I think it's like this spiral. These are 2. The importance of metaphysics needs a reset of our mindset. If we are able to reset our mindset, metaphysics become somehow naturally in the center. And now the last questions of Peter. I'm these days very much, or since a long time, very much strongly influenced by Jean Gebser. He's a German Swiss philosopher, and his idea is that we are now going on in a new mindset of the integral consciousness. And this allows us a completely different, not different, but somehow the approach to what you all these days said, and what I was just beginning your book, not yet finished. I was very astonished that you could say this, write all these without Gebser. And also I was very astonished that the Gebserians didn't talk about you. So there are two impulses, I think, which are helping us these days, also in my age. Maybe I'm the oldest under this group here, but still I feel it's a wonderful walk to go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Yeah, let's take the next question from Chris.
Hello. Yes, thank you. And thank you, Colin, for 2 wonderful weekends. I couldn't attend all of it, but what I did attend is highly illuminating, and I thank you for that. And we, I forgot what I was going to say now. No, the whole point about metaphysics is something I've been studying for the last 25, 30 years. And I do feel it is a sign of the times that, as Colin, you were saying earlier, metaphysics has been subdued or pushed aside by science. And the sign of the times is that it's getting back into our psyche now. We are beginning to have it come back in now. And there are no such things as coincidences. The very reason why it's coming back into our psyche is it is very important that we do put aside, as Peter Fenwick was saying, we start now to put aside the ego self's thinking patterns and look for other ways of thinking. And we will discover those, not from the ego self, but from the inner self, which is to do with the metaphysics of the individual and the collective. While you were talking, I came across, I was reminded of a quote about metaphysics from Ken Wilber, the contemporary American philosopher. In the book that he was talking about the Trump event, funnily enough, and he was talking about philosophy, and he says, the whole point of doing philosophy was to figure it all out once and for all, the last word. No philosopher wrote anything thinking that it would be true for only a year or two and then vanish forever. Metaphysics means finding what is always true, always the last word on the subject. And even if the philosophers didn't think it was actually possible to do that, it was what virtually all of them wanted to do. I think that very episode of what's happening at the moment in, as we've been referred to here, the shift in human consciousness that's occurring at the moment. We are moving into trying to understand the really fundamental premises and principles that undermine the human being condition. And where there are a lot of people coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, at the moment, who are talking more about the metaphysical pursuits. And I welcome that. And I think, Colin, you're one of those people.
Hope so. Can I just make a point here? One of the ideas I'm very keen on is that of the perennial wisdom, which I take to be the sum total of all the very best ideas that humanity has ever come up with, or an amalgam compendium of all that humanity has ever come up with. And it's not just in the last few thousand years that people have come up with good ideas. That's the last few thousand years they've been writing it down. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the great ideas that have come up over the last 200,000 years or 250,000 years. I spoke to a good friend of mine called Zia Sardar, who you may know, who runs is a Muslim who runs a paper called The Critical Muslim. And he said he really hates the idea of the perennial wisdom because it implies that you're sort of making once for all statements that will last you, and it becomes very kind of, what's the word, top down, dictatorial, etc., dogmatic. As I see the perennial wisdom, it's parallel with Popper's idea, that there is no bedrock truth. And he says, if you want to find out what is really, you can't really find out what is absolutely true. Sort of, what you can do is drive. He compares, say, scientific knowledge to the city of Venice, and he says the point about the city of Venice is that it's founded on mud, and there isn't solid foundation. But you bang in stakes until you can't bang them in anymore, and you say, right, that's it. That's as far as we can get. And it seems to me there's a nice analogy in there with the idea of the perennial wisdom, that you're not actually, there isn't a bedrock, but you drive things in until you can't drive them anymore. But the other thing is that one can see the perennial wisdom, as some people do, as some kind of ziggurat of all-time truth, immutable and permanent. I don't see it like that. I see it more like a living organism, which changes over time, doesn't necessarily grow, but it changes over time, responds. And I think if we had this collective idea of the perennial wisdom to which we can all contribute, and let humanity decide what is actually the great idea.
Yes, if I might come in there, there's in my studies of metaphysics, there are a lot of which has been to do with channeled information sources or mediums, if you like. And when it's all boiled down to one thing, and this is also a sign of the times, what we're now coming into is this trying to discover exactly what consciousness is. Mm. And it is a primary force, according to many channeled sources. And in fact, when you're thinking about truths, consciousness and its existence is the only one truth. Mm. Mm. The other, if you like, the perennial philosophies, if you like, that we like to think we're coming up with, they are always relative to this one truth of consciousness. So I agree with you. I think it's an organic thing coming out of the only one truth of consciousness. It's how consciousness explores itself, by having this continual evolution of philosophies, if you like.
Mm. Mm. Very good, very interesting. Mm.
We talk about consciousnesses, but I think there is a reality beyond the individual schools, and that original is a divine source itself. And what is important is that we actually make connection with the divine source. As somebody remarked, they were put off by seeing religions as just created by voices. Well, it isn't. There are voices in a sort of a funny way, but the real voice to listen to is a divine source itself, which is available not to people who are just religious, but for all of us. And this has been part of the problem, that the religions have tried to gather the control of access to the divine source to themselves. Whereas what religions need to do is make sure that all their membership, all those who are listening to them, are themselves trying to access the divine source itself and to work with it. And obviously from that, going on to work with others who have the same sense of being in touch. Now, how do we define the quality of the divine source? And I would say if it is not based on love, you've got a misconnection.
Yeah.
Good.
On that topic, I just wanted to say that, David, thank you so much for saying that. I completely agree. And when I was talking before, I was saying how we have to embody and experience metaphysics and explore metaphysics as an individual. When I said I didn't think we should debate metaphysics, what I meant is I didn't think we should only intellectualize it, but we had to use practices to explore as technologies. And I think that's what you were saying, David, as well, is that at the base of a lot of these religions, there is people who are steeped in practice and who are steeped in exploration of consciousness. And that's how we get to these philosophies and these ways of thinking. And without direct experience, you can't really get there. And by having embodied explorations of metaphysics, we can really go somewhere quite deep.
I think this is very much what the Quakers do, waiting on God, you know, in silence. James, we have one more question, I think.
Yes, let's take, no, yeah, it is getting late, but let's take the last question from Gillian.
Sorry, I was so enthralled in that last one. I couldn't agree more, actually, with what Ruby just said about experiencing. I just wanted to add, it's less of a question, I suppose, but just a perspective about the perennial wisdom. It's the first time I've heard that term. It's a lot of firsts today in terms of things I've heard for the first time. But my personal experience of perennial wisdom, I think, comes from a sense really that I was handed down from my family of being very deeply connected to ancestors and also to descendants who are yet to be born, which obviously makes a few assumptions, but I do have 2 children now, so they're safe assumptions to make. But I guess from that perspective, and I think my education has kind of for years has made me suppress that way of thinking. But in feeling connected to this continuous line, which I guess if you really wanted to take it to its extreme, we're sort of all the product of an unbroken line of successful organisms, right down to, you know, the first life forms. I mean, I think that's where you could take it potentially. But the idea that we are deeply connected in this way, that's how I would interpret perennial wisdom. And also that sense as well, it was a comment that came up in the breakaway room that we did, which was one of the people in the room said that they felt they were sort of too late in their life journey to be making a massive impact. But in my mind, if you feel that sense that you're part of that continuum, then there isn't really a beginning and an end in that sense. So I just wanted to kind of, I guess, in some ways it speaks into the idea of a perennial wisdom, but also speaks into the idea of a mindset and the question that Ruby had posed, which is about how do we change the cultural narrative? And for me, that's a massively important one that I'm now starting to really connect back to, which is stepping out of like dominant cultural narrative, which is sort of what I've been educated into, and leaning back into some of my family history, my stories, my roots. So yeah, it was, like I said, less of a question and more of just a perspective. I wanted to share that personal story. But thank you so much, Colin, and everyone. It's been an absolutely amazing day.
Thank you for that, Gillian. Did anyone want to respond to that?
Yes. Oh, good, you can hear me. Yes, I enjoy hearing you talk about youth and age. I've just been reading a book by a Buddhist Lama from Tibet, and one of the things that stays with me is you are young until you feel old.
Yeah, great. Well, I guess we should sort of close. We're getting a little bit over. Ruby, as our guest, do you have any closing words you want to give us?
No, just thank you so much for having me, and it's been a real pleasure.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. It's been great to have you, Ruby. And Colin, as the end of your program, do you have any last thoughts to give us?
Only again, thank you very much for taking part. I've enjoyed it enormously. And I see it as the beginning of something, you know, that we can develop over time. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Ruby, for your fantastic contributions today. I think they were very powerful, and I think everyone really responded well to your comments. Colin, thank you so much for your work, your program. It's been really fantastic. I hope everyone can bring a lot away from this program. And yes, and thank you everyone for joining us. On behalf of the Parry Center, I also wanted to give a special thank you to David and the Scientific and Medical Network, who collaborated with us for this program. So thank you so much for making this event possible. And yes, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Before we go, we'd just like to make a couple announcements. This morning we heard what the Parry Center is going to be up to in the next upcoming months. So this afternoon, let's hear from the Scientific and Medical Network, what they're going to be doing.
Yes, thank you very much, James. I just want to mention one book because Syed Hossein Nasser was mentioned. And this is a book called Man and Nature, a short book, which was written in 1967. And he was one of the first people who identified the ecological crisis or the ecological predicament as a spiritual crisis. And I've got most of what Syed Hossein Nasser has written, and I think he's an essential person. For what just came up also, with Gillian, the perennial wisdom. I mean, he is an articulation, his work's an articulation of that. And I'd like to add my thanks to Colin and his collaborators for a very stimulating program over the last couple of Saturdays. And I think one of the things that I've appreciated really, which I also appreciated about Colin's book, is really the comprehensiveness of it. Because most books do not have the same scope. You're not talking about flourishing societies and flourishing biospheres and convivial societies. You're not relating that to the actions, to the infrastructure, and then finally to the mindset, which actually underlies the whole thing. And I think that's what we're realizing, that the change that we need to make is so radical. And literally, as I suggested, we need to pull things up by the roots. In fact, and get the big exploitative systems out of the way so the green shoots can actually start coming up. So that's I think this is all part of it. And I think what we can do, what you can do now, is obviously within your own circle of influence, and we all have our circles of influence, but talk about what you've been listening to with your friends, post things on your social media, your websites, get the conversation going, because it's only if people really start talking about these ideas that they're going to become common currency. And don't think you just have to say it once. You have to keep on saying it, because otherwise people, they just don't get the message. I'm just going to share my screen now to just say something about the events that are coming up. We've got a very full program. And so this is what's happening just in the next week or 10 days. We've got Alex Evans, who's worked for me as a consultant to many governments and also AVAS. Politics Meets Psychology, an exploration of the places our inner and outer worlds collide. That's on Wednesday. Then on Friday, we've got Rupert Sheldrake with Institute of Noetic Sciences talking about his 40 years on from A New Science of Life, which Colin was saying he as a features editor in New Scientist gave it a plug when it first came out. And that'll be attended by a lot of people. You can book either on our website, scientificmedical.net, or Noetic Sciences. And then next Saturday, we have the Call to Unite, Voices of Hope and Awakening, which is an interview with Tim Shriver, who's a co-editor of a book exactly called The Call to Unite. And he is part of the Kennedy family and is an extraordinary individual. So hopefully you might be able to join us for that. And then the last two things to highlight, and this is a Galileo Commission event, how to revolutionize the materialist paradigm. So this is part of what we're doing in the Galileo Commission. Then we've got a major event in June. There's a lot more happening between May and June. This is just because something happening every week. So Vandana Shiva, we have an event which I think many people will be interested here. The Network, Resurgence Trust, Soil Association, Navdanya, and the Real Farming Trust, the very same, regenerating soil, regenerating health. And this will be, I think, an incredibly important discussion, especially at our time. And I just want to, if you're a member of the network, then you get access to all of these previous webinars. And just pointing out, the last thing I want to say, Galileo Commission, Expanding the Science of Consciousness Beyond a Materialistic Worldview. This is the report exists in 3 different versions: a full report, a summary report, and a layman's version. And so I'd encourage you to go and have a look at the website and support it either as a friend or a professional affiliate. So that's what's happening in the next period. And we will be sending out recordings with recordings links. So there'll be some further information like articles from Ian Rappel. And I love the word he's called rappel, because in French, rappeler means to remind. And so he reminded us, I think, of some important issues this morning. So thank you from me. Thank you from everybody, Eleanor as well. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, everybody, for attending. So I'll hand back to sign off to James in Cambridge. And then we'll both look forward to seeing you at other events. And obviously what is the revolution in the materialist paradigm sort of feeds into the PARI Center, What is Consciousness?
Thank you, David, for that. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. And I just want to share the message that you said as well. You know, the biggest way to make the changes that we want to make is to talk about it. So, you know, tell your friends what you've heard, tell your family, because that's where change comes from. It comes from us. So, yeah. Anyway, that's, I guess we should close the session. Thank you again, everyone. And we'll see you again soon here at the PARI Center and at the Scientific and Medical Network.
Thank you.